For decades, Alien has stood as one of the most influential sci-fi franchises ever created. But behind the terrifying xenomorphs, the dark corridors of the Nostromo, and the iconic line, "Get away from her, you bitch," there lies a story even more intense than fiction itself. A story of resistance, a story of reinvention, and above all, a story of a woman who Hollywood never quite knew how to handle. At the center of it all is Sigourney Weaver. At 75, she is no longer just an actress associated with a sci-fi legend. She has become something far bigger in cultural memory, a symbol of defiance in an industry that often decides who gets to matter and who gets forgotten. But the truth behind her rise, her battles, and her legacy is far more complex than most people realize. Because before Ellen Ripley became a cinematic icon, she was almost never born at all. Long before Alien became a masterpiece of science fiction horror, it was just another strange script floating around Hollywood studios in the late 1970s. At the time, no one was thinking about Sigourney Weaver. In fact, no one was even thinking about a woman. The character of Ellen Ripley, one of cinema's most important action heroes, was not originally written as female. Early drafts of the script didn't emphasize gender at all. In some versions, Ripley was simply Ripley, with assumptions leaning toward a male lead, because that's what studios expected from action-oriented films. Hollywood, at that time, had a very rigid belief system. Science fiction heroes were men, and women were usually support characters, love interests, or victims. That's just how it was. So, when the idea emerged that Ripley could be played by a woman, studio executives weren't just skeptical, they were uncomfortable. They believed audiences wouldn't accept it. They believed it would weaken the film. They believed it was a risk that didn't need to be taken. But two people saw it differently. Director Ridley Scott and producer Alan Ladd Jr. believed something radical. What if the most human person on the spaceship was a woman? That single decision quietly changed film history. Sigourney Weaver was not a Hollywood star at the time. She was not famous. She was not even widely known. In fact, she had barely appeared on screen at all. Her most recognizable role, before Alien, was a tiny, almost blink-and-you-miss-it 6-second appearance in Annie Hall. That was it. Meanwhile, studio executives had already imagined bigger names. Established actresses like Meryl Streep or Glenn Close were considered safer, more acceptable choices for leadership roles. Weaver was something else entirely. Tall, unusual, intense, and unfamiliar to mainstream Hollywood casting expectations. She didn't fit the mold. But when she auditioned, something changed in the room. There was no overacting, no performance designed to impress. Instead, there was stillness, control, presence. Ridley Scott reportedly saw something immediate in her, something that didn't feel like acting at all. It felt real. And in a film about survival in deep space, realism mattered more than star power. Against industry expectation, Sigourney Weaver was cast as Ellen Ripley. At the time, nobody realized what had just happened, but that decision would go on to reshape the entire future of female characters in cinema. Even after being cast, Weaver's position was far from secure. Studio executives were still uneasy about her leading role. They doubted the film's commercial potential with a woman at the center of a sci-fi horror narrative. That doubt showed in many ways, especially financially. Weaver was reportedly paid only a fraction of what her co-stars received. The imbalance wasn't just symbolic, it reflected how little faith the studio had in her role carrying the film. But Alien didn't need permission to become iconic. When it was released in 1979, audiences were stunned. Not just by the creature design, not just by the horror, but by Ellen Ripley. She wasn't a side character. She wasn't a victim waiting to be rescued. She was the survivor. And in the final act, when the last male authority figure falls, Ripley rises, not through luck, not through brute force, but through intelligence and determination. For the first time in mainstream science fiction, survival belonged to a woman who wasn't defined by anyone else in the story. Hollywood had not seen that before. After Alien became a massive success, everything changed. But not instantly. Hollywood still wasn't fully ready to accept what Ripley represented. Then came Aliens in 1986. This time, Ripley wasn't just a survivor. She was a warrior. And, more importantly, she was a mother figure fighting not just for herself, but for a child she had grown attached to in the story. This emotional shift transformed the character completely. Sigourney Weaver's performance in Aliens was so powerful that it earned her an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress. For a science fiction action film in the 1980s, this was nearly unheard of, but even that recognition came with limitations. She did not win. Hollywood still struggled to fully embrace genre performances at the highest level of prestige. Still, something irreversible had happened. Ellen Ripley was no longer just a character. She was a standard, a reference point, a new definition of what a female action hero could be. Success did not bring peace. In fact, it brought more conflict. The Alien franchise became increasingly difficult to control as different creative visions clashed behind the scenes. By the time Alien 3 entered development, the production was already in chaos. Scripts were rewritten repeatedly. Entire concepts were discarded. Directors came and went. One version even imagined Ripley on a wooden planet inhabited by monks who believed the alien was a divine punishment. Another version leaned heavily into industrial prison setting. Nothing stayed stable for long. Sigourney Weaver, now with more influence, pushed back against decisions she believed weakened the story. She wasn't just playing Ripley anymore, she was protecting her. One of the most controversial decisions involved the early death of beloved characters introduced in Aliens. Weaver reportedly opposed it strongly, believing it undermined emotional continuity. But the studio moved forward anyway. The result was a film filled with tension, not just on screen, but behind it. Weaver later described the experience as emotionally draining, even devastating. There were moments when she questioned whether she should continue with the franchise at all. Hollywood, it seemed, still wasn't ready to fully understand what Ripley meant to her, or to audiences. By the time Alien Resurrection arrived in 1997, the franchise had taken a very different direction. Ripley was no longer fully human. She had been cloned, altered, and fused with alien DNA. It was a strange, experimental concept that pushed the character into unexpected territory. Weaver agreed to return, but only under specific conditions. Ripley had to evolve. She had to change. She could not simply be repeated. The result was a version of Ripley that was darker, more complex, and far more alien than ever before. Audiences were divided. Critics were uncertain. But one thing was undeniable. Weaver continued to take risks with a character most actors would have abandoned years earlier. When later crossover projects like Alien vs. Predator were proposed, she refused to participate. For her, Ripley was not a franchise tool. She was a legacy, and legacies she believed deserved respect. Before Ripley, before Hollywood battles, before fame, there was Susan Weaver. Born into a family already connected to media and performance, she could have followed a predictable path. But she didn't. At a young age, she changed her name to Sigourney, inspired by literature and a desire to redefine her identity. That decision was more than aesthetic. It was symbolic. It was control. Tall, unconventional, and often underestimated, she spent much of her early life navigating spaces where she did not fit traditional expectations. At Stanford University, she studied English literature and lived a life far removed from Hollywood ambition. Later, at Yale School of Drama, she faced rejection, criticism, and doubt from instructors who did not see her potential. Some even told her she didn't belong in acting. Instead of stepping back, she leaned into experimentation, performing unusual avant-garde theater pieces that would eventually shape her fearless approach to performance. That rejection did not end her career. It built it. Weaver's rise exposed something deeper about Hollywood itself. It wasn't just about one actress fighting for recognition. It was about an entire system that struggled to imagine women in roles of authority, survival, and leadership in genre storytelling. Even after Alien and Aliens, she continued to face typecasting pressure. Studios wanted her to repeat Ripley endlessly, but she refused. Instead, She pursued dramatically different roles, psychological dramas, comedies, and character studies that challenged audience expectations. She turned down major commercial opportunities in order to avoid being trapped in a single identity. This wasn't rejection of success. It was protection of versatility. And in doing so, she reshaped how long-term acting careers could evolve. Over time, Weaver built a filmography defined not by repetition but by range. From intense dramatic performances to subtle comedic roles, she continuously shifted between genres with ease. Her work in Gorillas in the Mist showed deep emotional immersion into real-world activism. Her role in Working Girl displayed sharp comedic intelligence. Even her later appearances in films like Avatar demonstrated that she was still willing to explore new cinematic worlds decades after her debut. But through it all, Ripley remained her most defining role, not because it limited her, but because it opened the door for everything else. Sigourney Weaver's impact cannot be measured only through awards or box office numbers. It is visible in what came after her. Female-led action films became more common. Sci-fi heroines became more complex. Hollywood slowly began accepting that strength did not have to be masculine. Characters like those in The Hunger Games, Gravity, and beyond exist in a cinematic landscape partially shaped by Ripley's survival. Even without winning every major award, Weaver's influence became structural. It changed casting expectations. It changed storytelling possibilities. It changed who could survive the final act. Outside of film, Weaver built a life grounded in stability, activism, and long-term partnership. Her marriage to theater director Jim Simpson became one of Hollywood's quieter success stories, far from publicity, built on mutual respect and shared artistic values. She also became deeply involved in environmental activism, particularly wildlife conservation, inspired by her role in Gorillas in the Mist. What began as a performance turned into lifelong advocacy. Her influence extended beyond entertainment into real-world environmental efforts, gender equality discussions, and humanitarian causes. Today, Ellen Ripley stands as one of the most iconic characters in film history. But her existence was never guaranteed. She survived studio doubt. She survived creative conflict. She survived industry expectations that were never designed for her to succeed. And in doing so, she became something rare in cinema history, a character who outgrew the system that created her. And at the center of that transformation stands Sigourney Weaver, an actress who was never supposed to lead a sci-fi revolution, but did anyway, because sometimes the most unforgettable legends in film history are not the ones predicted by Hollywood. They are the ones it never saw coming.